Hi, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of the 11th annual Lemon Project Spring Symposium. Our theme this year, 4 Centuries of Black Women in America, Freedom, Activism, and Justice for All. Before we begin, I'd like to read the following statement. The Lemon Project stands with the rest of William and Mary in solidarity with our Asian, Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, and Southwest Asian colleagues and students to say that anti-Asian hate is unacceptable and has no place at William and Mary. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you the moderator for this panel, Dr. J. Watkins, who teaches in the history department at William and Mary. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to what promises to be an exciting panel. You see there, land acknowledgement was on your screen there for a moment. Thank you, Sarah, because I don't have the text of it in front of me. William and Mary acknowledges the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands of our campus, or lands that our campus is on today. The Cherokee, I should have practiced that pronunciation. Nottoway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattapony, Monacan, Nanesman, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Patawamek, Upper Mattapony, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal members, past and present. Thank you. So today we have, like I said, I'm very excited about our panelists today. I'll give all the bios first, and then we will then go in order, and afterwards hopefully have some time for questions. Put all your questions in the chat, and we will address them at the end whenever we open up for Q&A. First, we have Leanne Timreck with a paper, A Visual Narrative of the Black Emancipation Experience, the Sculpture of African-American Artists Mary Edmonia Lewis and Meta Warrick Fuller. Ms. Timreck is an independent folklorist and historical researcher. In 2016, she completed George Mason University's graduate certificate in folklore studies and has continued her professional development through graduate courses in history at Virginia Commonwealth, participation in professional conferences and personal development. In both 2017 and 2018, Ms. Timreck presented papers at the American Folklore Society Annual Conference on the topic of 19th century African-American sculpture. Ms. Timreck is currently researching a book on the emancipation-themed sculpture of the African-American artists Mary Edmonia Lewis and Meta Vaux Fuller, reflecting her interest in the history, culture, and narratives of 19th century African-Americans after emancipation. Then we'll have Lindsay Gray with her presentation, Cecile Fatiman, Entering the Haitian Revolution. Lindsay Gary graduated from the University of Houston with a BA in history and minors in dance and business administration, and with an MA in history and MPA in public policy from Texas Southern University. In 2018, she was selected as a Mellon Scholar in African American Studies. She works as an adjunct professor of history at Houston Community College and is currently a teaching assistant and pursuing a PhD in Africology and African American Studies from Temple. And last but not least, we have Monet Timmons with a presentation, Beyond Kitty's Cottage, Exploring Contested Commemoration Practices to Remember Catherine Miss Kitty Boyd. Monet Timmons is currently a third-year English PhD student and an African-American Public Humanities Initiative Fellow at the University of Delaware. Her research focuses on Black women in the archive from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. Through public humanities work, her research uncovers the fragments of these archives to reveal the larger complexities of these women's lives to make a larger intervention about Black women's lived experiences across space and time. Monet Timmons recently submitted a draft for publication regarding rhetoric surrounding campuses' histories with enslavement with a focus on Catherine Miss Kitty Boyd and Emory University's past. She is also co-curator of I Am an American, the authorship and activism of Alice Dunbar Nelson, a digital exhibition through the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. So without further ado, Leanne, take it away.
That darn mute button. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon and have the opportunity to talk to you all about the first African-American sculptors Mary and Monia Lewis, and Meta Warrick Fuller, and their artistic and historical legacy of the Black emancipation experience. So let me just bring up some slides. There we go. Lewis and Fuller were very talented and prolific artists. Their combined body of work spans nearly 100 years and tackled the themes of race and gender conflict in 19th century and early 20th century America. And although they garnered critical praise for their sculpture, they were really more than just great artists. In a world of white art, they broke racial barriers to render realistic Blackness in their sculpture. Throughout their lives, Lewis and Fuller would funnel their passion for racial equality and social justice into their art. Mary Church Terrell wrote in 1898 that, quote, "In spite of handicaps and discouragements, African-American women are not losing heart. Lifting as they climb, onward and upward they go, struggling and striving and hoping, seeking no favors because of their color, nor charity because of their needs. They knock at the door of justice and ask for an equal chance. An equal chance is all Edmonia Lewis and Meta Fuller asked for and fought for throughout their careers." In the rest of the presentation, I'm going to tell their story through their art, and specifically their emancipation sculpture. Lewis's emancipation sculpture, Forever Free, completed in 1867, and Fuller's Emancipation, completed in 1913, are notable, not only as some of the earliest representation of Black bodies in sculpture, but also the earliest emancipation sculptures by Black artists, male or female. These pieces of art are not just fine art. They're also rare artifacts that contribute materially to the historical record of the Black emancipation experience. By studying their emancipation sculpture, we not only see the historical narrative of emancipation from the African-American perspective, but we also gain insight into the lives of all Black women, to include Lewis and Fuller, within the racial and gendered constraints of 19th century America. A little biographic information is useful as background. Lewis was born in upstate New York in 1844 to an African-American father and a Chippewa Native American mother. She was orphaned by the age of 9 and adopted by her mother's sister. Edmonia attended Baptist Abolitionist School for 3 years, and in 1859 entered Oberlin College in Ohio. In 1862, Lewis was accused of poisoning her 2 white roommates, and while awaiting trial at Oberlin, she was attacked by a white mob and severely injured. She was subsequently found innocent of all charges, but additional race-based allegations in 1864 forced her to leave Oberlin before she graduated, and she moved to Boston to pursue her career as a sculptor. Upon arriving in Boston, Lewis soon connected with the abolitionist community, who played a critical role in her career. Her exposure to abolitionist rhetoric and art greatly influenced her work. They introduced her to the sculptor Edward Brackett, who trained Lewis as a sculptor. And most importantly, these influential abolitionists funded, publicized, and advanced Lewis's work. By 1865, she had successfully sold her first pieces of art, enough to fund a move to Rome, where she set up her own studio, all by the age of 20. She would live and work in Rome the rest of her life, achieving international fame and an extremely successful career. After her death in 1909, she was largely forgotten, but today she is celebrated as the first African-American and Native American sculptor, and many of her pieces are on permanent display at Howard University and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Meta Fuller was born in 1877 in Philadelphia to middle-class African-American parents. And by the age of 12, Mita was pursuing her artistic aspirations and attended several highly selective art schools in the Philadelphia area. By 1899, she had demonstrated an exceptional talent across a range of disciplines, most notably sculpture, and won a number of prestigious awards. She went on to study in Paris, returning to Philadelphia in 1902. But in this country, Fuller struggled unsuccessfully to sell her work, and she despaired that racism and sexism would prevent her from ever making a living at her chosen profession. However, her luck turned in 1906 when she was awarded a commission. She was the first commission actually ever awarded by the US government to an African-American woman to create a historical piece of art for the 1907 Jamestown Tercentennial Exposition. In 1909, Fuller married, and she settled down into a new domestic role as wife and mother. This would be a source of tension throughout her life, the struggle to balance societal expectations with her artistic career. In her own words, she noted that, quote, housework, nursing, sculpture, and occasional church work don't mix, no matter how carefully I introduce the ingredients. But despite her challenges, Fuller successfully built a body of work that included not only sculptures and paintings, but also theatrical sets, costume designs, original plays. She would also play an influential role in the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s as African-American artists began exploring themes of African history and culture. When she passed away in 1968, she left behind a legacy now recognized for its artistic brilliance and passion, which art historian David Artis calls, quote, a celebration of African-American heritage. In analyzing their two Emancipation sculptures, the first observation is that they differ in artistic style, emotion, and thematic presentation. Each piece represents the unique artistic and cultural influences on each artist at the time the work was created. Thus, Forever Free reflects Lewis's hopeful vision of freedom. And in contrast, Fuller's more somber depiction of the Emancipation experience reflects a vision shaped by 50 years of failed promises. Together, they represent a richly textured historical narrative spanning the first 50 years of Black freedom. The white marble sculpture Forever Free, sculpted in a neoclassical style, evokes those glorious first moments of freedom. Lewis gives her two subjects the physical features reflective of lives spent enslaved, to include muscular bodies, bare feet, and rough garments. The freedman stands triumphantly, head raised skyward, a shackled arm lifted, and conveys his newly won manhood. He rests one hand protectively on the shoulder of the kneeling woman beside him. With hands clasped in gratitude, the freedman looks joyfully to the heavens, gratefully accepting her new role of wife and mother. Lewis's work reflects the traditional abolitionist iconography, such as the broken chains and the kneeling freedwoman, to represent the themes of slavery and freedom. Lewis dedicated Forever Free to the abolitionist Reverend Leonard Grimes for his work on behalf of enslaved African Americans. 50 years later, Fuller completed Emancipation for the semi-centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. Using a rough bronzed finish, Fuller tells a darker and more nuanced emancipation narrative through the expression and physicality of her subjects. Her two subjects are side by side, gazing forward, and convey a sense of forward movement. They wear only the roughest of clothing around their waist. The freedman's masculinity is evidenced through the rippling muscles visible on his bare chest, and the freedwoman's sexuality and vulnerability are on display through her exposed breasts. The allegorical figure of humanity stands tearfully behind the two freedom travelers, head bowed down, while the tree of fate enshrouds the two travelers from behind. Fuller herself explained that, quote, humanity is weeping over her suddenly freed children, who beneath the gnarled fingers of fate step forth into the world unafraid. Both Forever Free and Emancipation also speak directly to the lives of 19th century Black women, and Lewis and Fuller consciously addressed three key gendered themes. First, the importance of visually communicating through their art the true character of the newly freed Black woman. In the face of popular 19th century racist iconography that presented Black women as Jezebels or mammies, Lewis and Fuller sought to use their art to legitimize the new identity of Black women and gain social acceptance of Black women as true women. Lewis, however, was constrained by an artistic genre that did not recognize Black bodies as art. Thus, she was forced to soften her visual representation of the freed woman by giving her Europeanized facial features and long flowing hair. By presenting her freed woman with a more neoclassically correct appearance and an appearance that was more accepted by 19th century white audiences, Lewis may have hoped to achieve recognition for her female subject as deserving of free woman status. With Emancipation, Fuller chose a daring approach to artistically express the emancipation narrative through the semi-nude bodies of two African-American subjects. Black nudity in art, and particularly of Black women, discomfited the African-American middle class, who saw it as an uncomfortable reminder of their slave heritage. Fuller, however, was willing to risk viewer discomfort. She used the nudity to convey the theme of transition from slavery to freedom. Looking deeper, Fuller is also depicting her subjects as the continuation of a proud and accomplished African culture, a culture that did not begin with the first Black slaves in America, but stretched back for centuries. The second theme is the critical role of women in reconnecting and reestablishing the Black family after emancipation. For the newly emancipated, the now legal act of marriage symbolized both their transition from slavery and their new identity as free women. In Forever Free, Lewis depicts the new reconstructed Black family and its patriarchal structure. Her freedman reflects the power and status of his new role as head of household, while the kneeling freed woman communicates her supportive role. This subservience was seen as a critical enabler for the Black man's success and necessary, even at the cost of her own personal freedom. In Fuller's Emancipation, Fuller positions her two subjects side by side. Perhaps Fuller is reflecting the equal contributions and sacrifices made by Black men and women over the past 50 years, or perhaps a recognition that for many Black families, racism and oppression did not drive them apart, but strengthened their commitment to and dependence on each other. The third theme is the recognition of the powerful sacrifices and contributions made by Black women in the pursuit of freedom. In the post-Civil War South, grinding poverty and racial discrimination forced over 1 million newly emancipated women into the labor force. In addition to being critical breadwinners, they managed their domestic responsibilities and played a vital role in the community infrastructure that supported Black life. And sadly, Black women were subjected to a disproportionate amount of racial and gender-based violence. And yet, against all odds, African-American women created a new identity and demonstrated agency over their lives as free women. Lewis captures the spirit in her free woman, who kneels in the eye of the historical storm to come, unknowing yet unafraid. She's no longer a cowering differential slave. She is a free woman of strength and courage. This freed woman will pursue economic and social equality, demand legal action to correct injustices, and protect her family. In Fuller's Emancipation, the grief-stricken figure of humanity who bears the collective memory of both slavery and emancipation conveys a prescient dread of what is to come. But Fuller also reflects the agency of the newly emancipated in the face of racial injustice. By depicting the Black woman as an equal partner in the pursuit of freedom, Fuller gives recognition and voice to all Black women who, at great personal risk, fought for the rights and identities of all African Americans. In closing, there are many reasons to honor the lives and art of Lewis and Fuller. As artists, they rendered Black bodies with dignity, strength, and intelligence in the face of racism. And as women, they conveyed an uplifting message of Black female empowerment. Their emancipation sculptures connect us with the memory of our past injustices and the sacrifices so many made in the pursuit of freedom. But their true legacy is capturing, for future generations, the history of the Black emancipation experience from the perspective of the women who lived it. Thank you.
All right, next up we have Lindsay. I think you are next. If you wanna take over the screen. Thanks for that, Lee.
All right. Hello, my name is Lindsay Gary. Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and get started with my presentation. So my presentation today is on Cecile Fatiman. Cecile Fatiman entering the Haitian Revolution, of course, for this amazing event, 11th Annual Lemon Project Spring Symposium. And so this, of course, is Cecile Fatiman in the background, by the way. But I want to go ahead and start off the presentation with this quote and prayer. The God who created the earth, who created the sun that gives us light, the God who holds up the ocean, who makes the thunder roar, our God who has ears to hear, you who are hidden in the clouds, who watch us from where you are. You see all that the white man has made us suffer. The white man's God asks him to commit crimes, but the God within us wants us to do good. Our God, who is so good, so just, he orders us to avenge our wrongs. It's he who will direct our arms and bring us the victory. It's he who will assist us. Throw away the image of the white man's God, who is so pitiless, and listen to the voice of liberty that sings in all of our hearts. And that's a quote by Dottie Bachman. And I cannot start any conversation on the Haitian Revolution without mentioning and starting off with this speech that was really a prayer at the ceremony at Vaux in Haiti, okay, which was led by Cecile Fatiman and Dottie Bachman. So the outline for today's presentation will be the methodology first. We'll talk about that briefly. The historical and cultural context, Cecile Fatiman herself, and the revolutionary and cultural impacts of her and, of course, her work. So my methodology was really twofold. First and foremost, the theory of Afrocentricity, which is a theoretical perspective developed by Africologist Dr. Molefi Kete-Asante that centers on African agency by viewing African phenomenon and experiences from the lens of African people. The second one is also an Africological theory. It is the theory of African womanism. Building on the Africana womanism theory of Clenora Hudson Weems, Dr. Nabdove's contribution is to further emphasize the concept of culture as a tool of analysis for understanding the nature of African women's experiences, addressing culture as a weapon of resistance and a basis for defining a new world order. These two were primarily used because that is, what I am currently studying in my PhD program, but also because only truly do I believe that we can understand the impact and the role of Cecile Fatiman, okay, through these lenses of these two theories, but also in the role that other African women have played around the world in their own agency and resistance. So first, I want to discuss the historical and cultural context of the Haitian Revolution. Just to give a quick overview of the Haitian Revolution itself, it was a revolution that took place on the island known as Haiti, which was the indigenous name, which was later turned to Haiti, okay? And so this island was originally populated by indigenous peoples of the Americas, and then later on by Europeans and Africans, those Africans being enslaved, were taken captive and then enslaved on this island. And so during the 1700s, the late 18th century, the African people of Haiti are going to fight for their revolution, and they're going to fight for their freedom, okay? The war itself is really twofold. One, to eliminate the institution of slavery, right? Or to stop the enslavement of African people on the island. But secondly, to ensure that they are able to remain autonomous and independent of European rule. So that really is a part of a civil war after they are going to end slavery and emancipate those Africans on the island. Although it is referred to as the Haitian Revolution, utilizing that theory of Afrocentricity, I prefer to refer to it as the African Revolution on the island of Haiti, right? Because it was a revolution of African people who just so happened to be enslaved on this island. But for the sake of simplicity and my time, I'm gonna go ahead and refer to it as the Haitian Revolution. So the story of the Haitian Revolution is often told from a Eurocentric and patriarchal perspective. And so today's presentation will be actually going against that and looking into the elements of Afrocentricity and of course, African matriarchy. And African matriarchy does not necessarily only relegate a woman to being in the role of a mother, although it is a very important role, that doesn't necessarily mean that that woman has children herself. So the emphasis on male leaders is these are ways that we can see how, and the fact that the patriarchal perspective is really applied in a lot of study of even such an African tradition, right? Which there's a strong tradition of matriarchy on the continent and across the diaspora. So that emphasis of male leaders such as Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Toussaint Louverture, and Dutty Buckman. Now you don't always hear about Dutty Buckman, but when you do hear about him, you still have to recognize that he's in that line of this tradition of highlighting these men who are, of course, should be emphasized, but they often leave off the women, the many women who were fighting this fight. Again, there's going to be an emphasis on the military leadership of the revolution, which goes to Dessalines and Louverture, and sometimes leaves out Dutty Buckman, right? Because there's an emphasis on this this warlike behavior, as many in the European tradition like to focus on. There's also typically a Marxist lens that you will see when looking at the Haitian Revolution, which is not to say that it's incorrect, but it's an emphasis that still has elements of patriarchy and elements of Eurocentricity, as we know that Marxism is a European tradition originally, okay? One example of this you can see is through the text called Black Jacobins, where the leaders of the Haitian Revolution are contextualized within the framework of the Jacobins of the French Revolution. Now, there's also, because of these things, going to be less emphasis on the Boudoon ceremony at Bois Carman, which is where the Haitian Revolution really begins. Actually, it begins prior to this, but it's really where it is ignited. This is where the people go forth and go forward with fighting after they've sat there and said to their deities and to God, like the prayers suggest with Dutty Buckman, that this is what we're going to do. We're going to achieve our liberation, and we're asking you all, these Loas and other divinities, to basically intervene and help us to win this fight. And it's important to note this. This is often left out because of the stigmatism of voodoo across the world. But this is what is going to start the Haitian Revolution. And of course, we'll talk about Cecile Fatiman's role in that in 1 second. There's very little emphasis on the role and impacts of women, right? There are countless women, and not just women who are fighting, who are important, but actually leaders, whether that's in terms of strategy or physically leading the military, dozens, hundreds of women who are doing these things in the revolution alongside men, not after men, but alongside them, and sometimes leading those men. There's also little emphasis on the fact that this was an African revolution, as I mentioned before. And the reason why I like to point that out is so that we can really understand its context across the diaspora and within the continent. It is no different than what you see with Maroons like Nanny in Jamaica, what you see with women that were mentioned in the previous presentation, right? There's a tradition of African women, regardless of where they are and how far removed they may be from the continent, of exercising their agency and upholding their culture. So Cecile Fatiman was the woman who I mentioned a second ago ignited the entire revolution. She challenged the male-dominated story while also challenging the male-dominated island. Okay, so Cecile Fatiman was actually born in France. And this is according to the oral history. There are some different stories that go along with that. But according to the most predominant story, she's born in France to a Senegalese mother and to a French father. And some point, she is sold along with her mother and the rest of her siblings into slavery by their father. Okay, and she's sold into slavery and she becomes enslaved on the island of Haiti. While she's there, she begins to arrange a network of people to establish a revolution. So this takes years. Sometimes people say 12 years, sometimes 20 years in the making for her to get this network across the island. And so the island of Hispaniola is both Haiti and the Dominican Republic, really getting the island, especially the part that's technically Haiti, to come together to start this revolution, okay? And it's really a legacy of Makandal, who was another enslaved person who started a revolution, a revolt previously on the island. So by doing this, she's really challenging this male-dominated story that I mentioned before, a very patriarchal, Eurocentric story that leaves women out, because she is really the foundation of what becomes the Haitian Revolution. Okay, and of course, she's directly challenging those planters or those people who were enslaving others on the island. Now, she's also going to be clearly an agent of African change and a revolutionary leader, like we mentioned before. And she is a mambo, meaning she is a voodoo priestess. So she is the person who is going to say the prayer along with Dutty Buckman. I don't have the exact words for that, which is why I read his, but say the prayer and actually preside over that voodoo ceremony, okay? Which I'll talk about that oath that she required those people there to take. And it was a combination of enslaved people, free people, and those who were considered to be Maroons. And so I want to read this quote from the text by Bayina Bello, who's an amazing scholar on the Haitian Revolution. She's from Haiti herself, and she's written numerous books about this. Cecile trained her network to be stealth while transmitting information from plantation to plantation, miles away from each other. She created codes for names of places and people so that enslaved informants could not notify slavers. It took Cecile and her network of women, notice her network of women, years to organize the most famous gathering in Haitian our story. So she refers to it instead of history or her story, our story, okay? Now referred to in books as the ceremony at Bois Common. And this is from her text, She Rose of the Haitian Revolution. She would walk miles and miles at night, risking her own life, similar to our Harriet Tubman here in the United States, risking her own freedom, her own life, after knowing freedom in another place, right? Which is partially what pushes her to do this, right? And of course, her practice of African spirituality as well. But she risked herself over and over again for years to ensure that the people around the island could really get together and put together this revolution. So they're going to, by doing this, what she's going to do along with the other leaders, particularly women, is actually grab the leaders at other plantations to establish just how and when they would come together to start this fight. So some of her methods include, like I said before, creating an island-wide codified network of covert communication. And so another reason why I like to call this an African revolution, because this is something African people employ all over the world, right? We know about Harriet Tubman and the singing of what we call Negro spirituals with coded messages to get people to freedom, right? So this is very reminiscent of that, except rather than them escaping and becoming free, she's actually wanting to free the entire island, not just a few who are willing, okay? And this is not to undermine Harriet Tubman's contribution at all, but just to paint the picture of the difference as well. She's going to organize the meeting at Bois Common itself, and she's going to use voodoo, okay, to allow for the ancestors and these divinities to help guide this ceremony. African spirituality is the center point, the pinnacle point of this revolution. So when I talked about earlier about how many of our typical texts we see around the Haitian Revolution emphasize the military, well, the military was a result of the spirituality that the African women on this island were bringing, okay? So that is a result. That is not the first, it wasn't a military battle before it was anything but an aspect of African culture, which was really being manifested through the women on the island. Okay, and so she requires the people who were gathered there at that ceremony, and of course everyone was not invited, just the people who were willing to fight and who were helping to lead the fight. She brings them to this ceremony and has them recite after the praying and all the things that happened at the ceremony, to recite an oath. And that oath is an oath of freedom, and saying you're either going to accept liberation, or you have to be willing to accept liberation at all costs, including the cost of death, which in African tradition is not really death, it's moving on to another realm, right? But either way, it's this oath. And also an oath of secrecy and solidarity to what was happening in that movement. And now to kind of close, I want to talk a little bit about these revolutionary and cultural impacts of what Cecile Fatiman was doing. So again, the African woman is the foundation of this movement, as she is with many other movements, upholding and passing down culture in the tradition of the African spirituality and other ways, but also in the reclamation and the reconnection of cultural memory, okay? African spirituality and communication with the ancestors was fundamental. And the people of the island relied on their guidance. They relied on the guidance of these divinities for their strategic meeting, in which again was organized at that Bois Common ceremony. So Cecile Fatiman is acting as a connector between these spiritual energies and these people on the island. And just to be clear, when we read that first quote, which was a prayer of Duty Bookman, that quote mentioned him, and it mentioned he when it was referring to God. And I have to say that I'm curious, excuse me, who translated it, because I can almost guarantee you it was translated, even that quote, even though it's very, much intertwined with this revolution and into voodoo, that it was probably translated with a Eurocentric lens, because in the African tradition, God is both man and female. So it would have said she, him, right? She or her. I'm sorry, her or him. Okay, she or he. And to continue these cultural impacts, Fatiman's role was central to what would ultimately become the first Black free republic, the first. She embodies the phrase, only the Black woman can say when and where we enter, which was the original title of this symposium, okay? She embodies that. She provided both the permission and pathway for what will become the most successful revolt of enslaved people in world history, and most importantly, their liberation. There is clear evidence of the essential role of African women in African revolutions and in African spirituality, and the role of African women throughout the Americas by looking and studying the role of Cecile Fatiman. And lastly, she is going to use culture as a weapon of resistance and a basis for defining a new world order, which is what Dr. Nada quotes and how she defines African womanism. And I think that's a very important thing to look at when we look at this, this revolution that was the Haitian Revolution, right? Because this woman, Cecile Fatiman, along with countless other women, are going to use their culture, use their spirituality, use their traditions to fight off oppressors, major violent oppressors, right? Using their tradition of agency, their tradition of women's equality, their traditions of communication to successfully fight this off. And again, as a basis for defining a new world order. So not only did it impact Haiti, but as we know, the Haitian Revolution led to many other things around the world, including later on, the emancipation of African people in Colombia, in the Dominican Republic, and in the United States. So really a true basis for a new world order. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lindsay. That was wonderful. Next up, we have Monet. I think, Lindsay, you have to unshare before Monet can take over. I think that's how the tech works. All right, Monet, up to you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you also to my fellow panelists for these amazing presentations. It's always inspiring to hear about other people's work and what other people are doing. So thank you so much for that knowledge. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. On February 6, 2011, the final day of the Slavery and the University Histories and Legacies Conference at Emory University, hundreds of people filled the pews of Old Church to celebrate the life and legacy of Catherine Miss Kitty Boyd and other enslaved people in Oxford, Georgia. Attendees ranged from Black and white community members, Emory faculty and students, and visiting scholars attending the conference from across the world. Hymns and praise songs from the Mount Zion Baptist Church Choir echoed across the historic building as descendants and current residents shared memories of their ancestors that had been passed down through generational oral storytelling. Of these descendants included Darcel and Cynthia Caldwell, the great-great-great-granddaughters of Catherine Miss Kitty Boyd, who traveled from Pennsylvania to honor their ancestor. Not aware of her ancestor until 2009, Darcel remarked, quote, "I had no idea that I had ancestors that had such an impact on the history of this country. It helps me figure out where I fit in, and I think that's one great advantage Black Americans have the ability to say, this is where I fit in." The ceremony closed with the unveiling, The ceremony closed with the unveiling of Atlanta-based artist Lynn Marshall Lynn-Myers' Unraveling Miss Kitty's Cloak, a mixed media photosculptural quilt installation created in collaboration with Black citizens of Oxford, Georgia. As the 30-foot quilt unfolded across the church floor, attendees rose to their feet for a standing ovation, witnessing the colors and fabric that pieced together various Black ancestors of the small town. Black citizens who collaborated with Marshall Lynn-Myers marveled and gasped at the final product. pointing out the obituaries, military pictures, graduation photos that they contributed to the project. Inspired by the Yoruba Ugungun masquerade costume, the installation connected the living and the dead through materials and photos that were significant to the participants' family history. Descendants read their ancestors' names out loud, honoring and speaking their life into this public space as a form of memory work. Not only was the piece a celebration of Catherine Boyd, but it was also a celebration of all the Black people that contributed to the history of Oxford, Georgia, and the United States. And so I also just want to provide just a brief background about Catherine Boyd and who she was. So Catherine Miss Kitty Boyd was born 1822, and she's remembered by white citizens of Newton County, Georgia, as Kitty, the loyal enslaved Black woman owned by Methodist Bishop James Osgood Andrew, first president of the Board of Trustees of Emory College in 1836. However, Bishop Andrew's roles as a bishop and an enslaver of at least 42 other people were not acceptable to the United Methodist Episcopal Church. In order to keep his positions as trustee president and church bishop, he had to free his enslaved persons. During the General Conference of 1844 in New York, Northern delegates challenged Bishop Andrew, questioning his status as an enslaver and reiterating that the holding of enslaved persons went against Methodist Church values and teachings. Bishop Andrew argued that he was an unwilling enslaver since Catherine and other enslaved persons were bequeathed to him through his second marriage. Not tolerating his enslavement of people, the church then split between Southern and Northern Methodism and would not be restored until 1939. The lack of obtainable information about Catherine makes it easier to create and maintain a false narrative. Even before Catherine's death in 1851, Bishop Andrew had already begun the process of creating an identity of her as seen through a letter to the 1844 General Conference. In the letter, Bishop Andrew never refers to Catherine by name, but instead as, quote, a mulatto girl who refused to go to Liberia of her own choice and remains legally his slave, causing him to have been made a slaveholder legally, but not with his own consent. Bishop Andrew presents his dilemma and what seems to be an inconvenience of being a slaveholder as a situation that is out of his control. Due to her loyalty, Bishop Andrew gifted Catherine with her own cottage in 1842, where it is believed she remained until her passing. Following Catherine's death decades later, public figures and members of the institution adopted Bishop Andrew's memory of Catherine to construct their own narrative. More specifically, white citizens relied on the cottage to preserve this memory. After the Andrew family house burned down, Emory trustee and Coca-Cola stockholder H.Y. McCord purchased the remainder of the land, including Kitty's cottage, in 1938. A year later, July 4th, 1939, McCord moved the cottage to the Salem Campground, a religious revival meeting area where it served as a museum. McCord's goal for the museum was to celebrate Southern Methodism and the Confederacy. In preparation for Kitty's cottage, in preparation for these revival meetings, Salem Campground advertised Kitty's cottage in newsletters and pamphlets as its main attraction for visitors. White visitors to the newly relocated site marveled at the history captured in the cottage, such as the hanging portrait of General T.J. Stonewall Jackson and the engravings of Bishop James Osgood Andrew, Bishop Warren Candler, and General Robert E. Lee. White visitors especially enjoyed the engraving of the Confederate Note Memorial, a poem and art piece commemorating Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. So this here is just, the picture is a bit blurry, but this was the cabin as it was moved at the Salem Campground. And as you can see right here, Kitty's cottage is written on the side of the cabin. So this is where we kind of start seeing the name and language using to describe this site as Kitty's cottage. In 1991, Salem trustees began discussing moving the cottage back to Oxford, Georgia. By 1993, Oxford Mayor Jack Atkinson asked white citizens of the town to assist him in completing the cottage's transfer to Oxford. The Historical Society took responsibility for the site in 1995, where the society then produced a plaque in 2000 that currently reads, Kitty's Cottage was built in 1842 by Bishop James O. Andrew for an inherited slave who could not be freed and still live in Georgia. Kitty preferred to remain with the Andrew family rather than to be sent to Africa. In 1938, Kitty's Cottage was bought and moved to Salem campgrounds for safekeeping. In 1994, the board of Salem Campground offered to help move Kitty's Cottage back to Oxford. The city and the Oxford Historical Shrine Society worked together to help bring this sacred treasure back home. It was placed behind Old Church near its original site. It is now a museum. Once the cottage was moved to Oxford, Mayor Atkinson and those assisting him redesigned the interior of the cottage, replacing the portraits, engravings commemorating the Confederacy with the kinds of objects that would have been present in antebellum slave cabins. The cottage continued to attract visitors at its new site. Museum tours consisted of white women in period dress who led visitors through Kitty's cottage, emphasizing the great love Kitty had for her children, a love shared with the white Andrew family. And these are, quotes from visitors themselves. Because of anthropologist and former Oxford College professor Mark Oslander's extensive research, we can uncover pieces of Catherine's life while analyzing the troubling and messy history of the site. However, we must also come to terms with what this information means for us today. How do we reconcile a violent and contained past? How do we situate the controlled narrative of Catherine and the site in our current discussions of white supremacist culture? How does Catherine's narrative, though incomplete, overshadow the lives of other enslaved people and their descendants in Oxford? Black citizens of Oxford contest this complicated history through oral history and oral storytelling, often calling the site a place of violation, not of love, reiterating how a space can become a symbol of hatred and violence for many. Oslander finds that most Black citizens choose to avoid the site altogether, since it is not a site of memory for them, but instead a site designed for and by white citizens. There is a shift away from the cabin being a Black woman's living space to becoming a site of exploitation and appraisal of a past deeply entrenched in white supremacy. Despite their omission from public history, Black citizens in the Covington and Oxford area, both enslaved and free, created alternative ways to practice agency and continue their ancestors' legacies through religious and educational institution building, preserving and documenting their lives, and community organizing. These commemoration practices demonstrate a larger tradition of Black collective memory work that is often obscured by white public memory. To understand the importance of these traditions and practices, it is necessary to look beyond the 2011 Slavery and the University Conference to understand how Black citizens have always been aware of their past and invested in celebrating themselves and their ancestors. By placing these hidden narratives in conversation with one another, as the piece Unraveling Miss Kitty's Cloak successfully does, the scholarship surrounding Black commemoration in Oxford expands and reveals the impact of enslavement on several generations while centering Black commemoration practices as spaces for envisioning a more complex history of this past, to remember Catherine and other enslaved people. Creating a counter-public sphere, Black citizens relied on religious and educational institution building as physical spaces of freedom and to cultivate a Civil War memory. In 1867, Tom Anderson, Israel Godfrey, Robert Hayman, George Washington Sims, and several other formerly enslaved men founded Rush Chapel United Methodist Church, the first African-American Methodist church established by African-Americans in Oxford. Rush Chapel was deeply embedded in the Black community, being one of the first public spaces for Black members to convene, cultivate an identity, and practice religion. Not only did Rush Chapel serve as a religious institution, but it also operated as a schoolhouse for children, thus reiterating the double function of these public spaces. The practice of forming such institutions gives insight into how formerly enslaved people recognize themselves as citizens with agency while constructing their identity as a community. The existence of Russ Chapel Church and other religious spaces highlights Black citizens' commitment to preserving history despite external factors such as the lingering effects of slavery paired with the current white containment of histories. And I would also just like to add that Russ Chapel Church is still operating today. So just thinking about this longer history. The early organization and freedom practices of formerly enslaved people and their descendants in Oxford cultivated future generations that continue these same conventions to honor both the past and the present. Reverend Dr. Avis E. Williams has become integral in creating community and church events that rely on calling the names of ancestors as a form of memory work. Williams was born 1958 in Covington, Georgia, which is a neighboring town in Oxford. And she is also the graduate of both Oxford College, class of 1978, Emory University, where she received her BA in chemistry after leaving school and later returning, and she graduated in 1998, and Emory's Candler School of Theology, where she received both her Master of Divinity in 2008 and her Doctor of Ministry in 2018. Williams's family history demonstrates the early methods employed by free and enslaved Black people to redefine their freedom through institution building. Williams found a handwritten note from her great-great-great-grandfather, Reverend Tony Baker, proving that he was literate and educated. Reverend Tony Baker was not enslaved, but was an indentured servant to a prominent white family of Emory College's funding board. The family educated him, allowing him to further his education at Springfield Baptist Church, which is now Morehouse College in Augusta, Georgia, and founded the Bethlehem Baptist Church, originally the Colored Baptist Church, in 1849, where he pastored from 1859 to 1896. Williams was always aware of the circulating narratives about Catherine and other enslaved Black people, yet the prioritization of Catherine's narrative, especially when tethered to Kitty's cottage, the site, caused Williams to question, quote, "What about the other people who stayed here?" End quote, in reference to the other 12 to 13 Black families that continued to live in Oxford. Exploring the narrative of descendants such as Avis E. Williams provides a fuller story of this complicated history that is often not considered in public memory, even though there are similar issues surrounding power and labor that exist today. Continuing the legacy of her ancestors, Williams utilizes her platform as a pastor, an educator, and board member to uplift Black community members through events and programs in the Oxford and Covington area that require members to remember and honor their ancestors. One of the events includes a program held by the Oxford African American Historical Society, which honors current Black community members who are making a difference. Williams's own mother, Imogen Williams, was honored in previous years due to her work as a historian uncovering Oxford's history. Other events include the annual, that's my timer. Other events include the annual MLK Day program, Juneteenth celebrations, Easter celebrations, and the walk across the Morris Ford Bridge, where 4 Black people were lynched and murdered in 1946. One of the most important events that honors the ancestors is the Calling Name Reunion, which is held every other year. Starting in 2011, Williams and other community members invite families near and far to participate in this event, allowing them to honor and call the names of recently passed family members. The program is a celebration of life and ancestors with food, drinks, and familiar and new faces. Attendees spend the day remembering their loved ones. The act of calling a name is important in Black memory work, as speaking a name gives them life, celebrating their life on earth as descendants honor them and continue their legacies. Williams emphasizes that we celebrate family and we celebrate heritage, while also highlighting how calling names is a way to bring us back together, reminding community members about their home and past, despite the complicated history that lingers. Shifting our attention to Black community members' communal efforts, both past and present, reveals the formation of alternative narratives and histories that are not part of white public memory. These celebrations, practices, and religious institutions demonstrate a commitment to remembering a Black past that was integral not only to Emory University's history, but to American history as well. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Monet. Thank you to all of our panelists. I think that was this has been a I think, a wonderful panel, and it has certainly gotten me thinking in some ways. There is a question in the chat, so we'll start with that. Lindsay, it is for you. Someone points out that the Wikipedia article states that Fatiman lived to be 112. What was the rest of her like, or what was the rest of her life like, after the revolution?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've heard the same thing. I've come across the same thing in my research. Most of my research on Cecile Fatiman is based on archives and work from Bayina Bello as well. And according to everything I've seen, that she did live to be 112. And they also say that she lived to be 112 with all of her faculties. So she was still, she still had her recollection, her memory was all still there. So as far as I know, and again, I'm still doing more research on her later life, she still was very involved politically. She was actually a family member, and in relation to some of the early presidents and leaders of Haiti, what would become Haiti. So she was still pretty active. I don't know exactly what happened, from up until 112. I know she had children, but that's still something I'm trying to uncover right now. That's a great question.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all still have our faculties at that age, even after, I think, such a very active life.
Yeah.
Which that also kind of builds on another question that there was another question about oral histories passed down in modern Haiti, which I think oral history also is a question for all of our panelists. How has oral history been useful, or how might it be? Or, how do you sort of see oral histories, and kind of blending that with another question, with Black women in these histories and in that kind of methodology? And I'm thinking, Lindsay, of sort of centering African womanism in that. I know it's kind of broad, but that's just kind of.
Well, I think sometimes we tend to, when we look at research, not at least in the past, not really value in the Western standpoint, not really value oral histories as being equal to written footage, written records, right? But that is just as valuable to me, because especially when we're looking at Black women and African stories, for a long time, depending on where you were from, that was the way that information was passed down, was orally. There's my favorite proverb, and I'm going to call it a proverb because a friend of mine, he's from Ghana, he says it, and he says it's what people call it in Ghana, where he's from. But he says our elders are our libraries, right? Like, our elders are the archives. They're the ones who are the keepers of these stories. They're the griots, right? They're the ones who pass these down. So absolutely, I think that these things matter. Everything doesn't have to be physically written down to be valuable and to be true and to be complete. So obviously there are ways our memories can fade, and there are certain things that we have to be able to decipher, just like we would with any other primary source or any other source. You have to be able to read between the lines and apply certain methodologies, but I don't think that it makes them any less valuable in contributing these things. And I know a lot of what we do know about Cecile Fatiman is from the oral tradition, but there are a few archival records that mention her. But again, if you look, depending on what time period you're looking in, sometimes women weren't mentioned, depending on who was writing them and what perspective they were coming from. They didn't really mention much about women. And if they did, you have to really be able to tease through all the things that they're saying and get to the root of what you're looking for. So I definitely think they're extremely valuable.
Yeah, I would just like to add to Lindsay's point and say, that we have been, I think, trained as scholars, especially not to consider oral history as important or as fact, but like she said, this is an archive, right? So even within the context of Catherine Boyd and the Black citizens in the Oxford community, they relied on oral storytelling to pass down these histories, to connect with one another, to remember their ancestors. And I think that's important, especially within private spheres as well, when you're having these discussions within Black churches, within Black family homes, because sometimes you can't have these same conversations within public spheres, especially white public spheres, in fear of retaliation or what that might mean for your family's future. Yeah, so absolutely, I think the oral storytelling tradition does need to be taken more seriously and seen as a way to archive Black life, for sure.
I do a lot of work with queer and LGBT oral history, and, you know, face many of the same kind of challenges to quote unquote validity still today in my own work. There was another question from the audience. Or Lee, did you have anything about the sort of oral history, cultural memory passing down?
Well, I would just, the only thing I would add is that in doing the research on the art as an artifact, art as a history, as a historical record, the same applies, of course, to oral narratives, any kind of artifacts at all, because of the lack, in many cases, of actual traditional historical documentation. These pieces of information are critical to understanding the history, because you're so limited, and or they were written from a perspective that was a white perspective or an accurate perspective, and therefore these are critical to getting through the true story of what life was like, or what happened during these time periods.
You just reminded me of I teach a course on monuments called Dixie's Monuments,
Right.
very broadly, and getting students to understand that these monuments are legible, and that you can turn your scholar's eye to, you know, what seems to be, or what is oftentimes a concrete and, you know, very fixed object, but does in fact have a lot more to tell us if we know how to read it.
Well, and an interesting note is when Fuller completed her monument, Emancipation, in 1913, at that period of time in our history, there were already over 500 Confederate monuments spread across the country, and there were 2 in existence that were told the story from the other perspective. That gives you some contrast.
We had another question from the audience. Can each of the panelists speak to how the commemoration of Black women fits into our modern day public history discourse about who should and should not be memorialized on national and local levels? Well,
I would answer it a little bit this way, is that, again, looking at the sculpture, I see them in the context of today, where there's much has been written about the lack of public understanding of the true history of the period, particularly I was interested in, which is the period of post-emancipation, first 50 years. There's, you know, we tend to just sort of jump from the Civil War to the civil rights. We skip this critical period of American history. And in terms of commemoration, it's really more around how you use them, and how you interpret them, and how you apply them to make them relevant to today. And what I see in the sculpture, and not just these, there's art, there's these oral histories, all sorts of things, but they can play such an amazing role in educating the American public in a way that's more interesting, more relevant, and sort of a more stick to it, because if you can study the history, you can study the past through these stories, either of the Haitian information around the woman there who and her history, or through the Catherine's history, or through the sculpture of 2 women who lived and experienced what it was like. You have I think these are really great educational tools for the public, and as part of our public history. And that's why I think they really play an incredible role. These commemoration, the memorial ceremonies, how we create those and use those is a way to educate and inform the public of the real history of these amazing Black women.
Yeah, and I think to add on to what Lee was saying, I think there's a difference between, there are ways we can differentiate between how we use that type of thing, right? So am I going to drive down street and see like a huge statue of a person, or is it going to be an art with context or the art itself, and we can have a talk about it? Because I think sometimes, you know, I've heard a lot of people saying, oh, we have to tear them down, and honestly, I understand that too. Some of these, especially coming from Houston, I'm from the South, and recently they, the city tore down a huge Confederate statue, renamed a lot of streets, and I'm very happy that happened. But at the same time, I think we have to keep those things so that we can study them and not get rid of what was actually happening. And the fact that people chose to put them up, that's very telling, right? Because if a community nearly 100 years later, 75 years later, wants to make a statue of a Confederate soldier, what does that tell you about those people, right? What does it tell you about their value? So I think by like destroying them, you're actually ruining, well, not ruining, but you're actually like eliminating a part of history. Even though it's a painful part, it's important to keep those things as record, because that's a part of the record, right? Because one day somebody will say, oh, well, nobody, there was no such thing as a Confederacy. People have never been racist or owned, you know, or enslaved people. That can happen. So do I think they should be on the corners of streets and in public parks? Absolutely not, right? But at the same time, I think that the ones that were created should stay somewhere for study, right? Somewhere so that people know what was happening and how we can keep those as records. Like Lee was saying, these are forms of records. At the same time, I would love to see more public monuments, wherever that is in the country. I would love to see more of those that are actually highlight women and that tell the stories of Black and or African women, in particularly in Indigenous women, those stories that are really not told and highlighted. I would love to see them. I know it was mentioned earlier that one of the, I can't think of her name. I can't think of the artist's name, but anyway, when she made the painting, the first one, I can't think of her name right now, but when she made the sculpture, not the painting, the sculpture, she, you know, felt like she needed to kind of taint the way that the Black woman looks, right? Had to give her a certain hair texture and, you know, certain facial features. I would love to see our women highlighted in a way that is truly who they are, and not even to, you know, because the fact that you felt like you have to do that with art, you know, that says a lot. So I would love to see that and to tell more of these stories publicly. You know, if we're going to take down Confederate statues, let's put some women in there and done amazing things. Let's replace them with something else.
Exactly. And I think like intention and interpretation is all very crucial in a lot of this type of memory work and commemoration practices. So even as we see with Catherine Boyd, how her living space becomes manipulated to preserve white Southern men, right? So as Lindsay and Lee were saying, it really depends on how are we addressing these issues and how are we telling a fuller story that really captures the lives of Black women. And I think that many public monuments that attempt to do so fail to do that. And I think this is kind of going to Leah's question about material culture as well. What is kind of like the material objects or the ephemera that makes up a lot of these monuments? So if we're filling a formerly enslaved Black woman's cabin with artifacts of the Confederacy, how does that deter away from who she was as a person and her experiences in slavery? And she was also a mother and she was also a wife. So how does she become erased based on the material objects placed within that space? So I'm happy now that Emory is actually planning to do a public commemoration and monument towards Catherine Boyd. So I'm excited for how it's going to turn out and how they plan on capturing her life.
I'm reminded of something you said, Monet. I participated in the 2006 centenary to remember the 1906 Atlanta race riot, and the ways that we had a full weekend of programming and then ended it with a graveside service, and I thought it was a very interesting way to recapture and to reclaim that narrative from the lack of memory, if you will. But it got me thinking about the ways that we can materially remember and reenact. But I think we are officially out of time. You know, so if anybody has to go, thank you for joining us. But I imagine we'll leave this open for a little bit to kind of continue conversation. But yeah, if anybody has to dip out, thank you for coming today. And it has been a pleasure, but we'll leave this open for a bit to kind of keep going.